So there are two sections to this lecture. There is the inflation part of this, which is kind of building off of what we learned about when we talked about GDP. So when we talk about gross domestic product, we were able to introduce inflation because we had the benefit of having our first experience with a price level, which was the GDP deflator. So the GDP deflator takes the information that we've already had from nominal GDP, the information that we calculated with real GDP by using the base year, and we can combine that to create an estimation of the average prices in the economy and then see how much more or less expensive on average they are over a period of time. But the inflation that we want to calculate in terms of individual households and consumers making choices, we're going to be interested in understanding a different kind of price level, which is going to be the consumer price index. Now, after we talk about that, we'll talk about kind of the shortcomings of CPI, but then we'll actually talk about the theoretical reasons for inflation, which is kind of the main, outside of calculating and understanding what the consumer price index is, one of the main takeaways from this lecture is to understand, okay, why is inflation a problem? Theoretically, maybe it shouldn't be, but because of certain reasons, we do have issues that are caused by inflation. And so that is kind of where we're going to head in this lecture. The second half of this kind of area of measuring macroeconomic performance is through unemployment, which is talking about kind of how do we measure how people have jobs and who doesn't have a job, and how do we measure that, and kind of what are the consequences of an unemployment and how is it different based on what circumstance you're under. So that will be the second half, but for right now, we're going to talk about the first half, which is kind of continuing on our discussion of inflation in last lecture and kind of wrapping up that topic. So before we adjourned, we talked about the producer price index, which is basically a leading indicator in the economy that kind of indicates or gives you an early warning that, okay, inflation may be on the horizon. GDP deflator, one of the issues with GDP deflator is it's including every single good or service that can be produced in the economy. And so for an individual person's perspective, we might not be interested in how much, steel beams and excavators and things like that cost. We're more interested in how much do paper towels cost, and how much does food cost, and how much is our rent, and how much does transportation, education, and healthcare cost. So to solve that problem of getting a relevant estimate of how much our individual cost of living is changing, we are going to utilize the consumer price index. And so the definition of the consumer price index is as follows. It is a price index that measures the costs of the market basket of a typical urban American family. So this sounds really bizarre, but really there are a couple things you need to take away. First thing is that it's a price index. So whenever we're measuring the changes in prices or we're trying to measure inflation, we're utilizing something that's known as a price index. So GDP deflator was a price index, PPI was a price index, CPI or consumer price index is going to be the one that we focus our attention most on. And it's measuring the cost of a market basket. Now, we didn't have a market basket in the GDP deflator because it included every single good or service in the economy. What we're going to do with the consumer price index instead is we're going to create what's known as a market basket, which is going to be a hypothetical set of goods that we would estimate the average family would consume. And so the difference here is we want to see how the CPI directly affects households. So I wrote the wrong effect. It should be affect. So how it directly affects households. And so this is going to be more relevant to our everyday purchases and how much our purchasing power is fluctuating based on how fast our wages are changing. Also, compare that to how fast the prices are changing. So, consumer price index is the price index that's measuring the cost of a market basket that is of relevant goods and services to a typical urban American family. So, what do we mean by urban American family? Basically, when we're measuring the changes in prices, what we're going to do is we're going to collect data from metropolitan areas. So, the closest regions that exist in terms of populations. It could be the Denver, Aurora area, the Detroit, Warren, Dearborn area. Um, they include the major big cities like San Francisco, Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, Philadelphia. So all of these areas, um, they're measuring the changes in prices of goods and services in that area. And then they'll weigh that based on the population relative to the whole population. So naturally, New York and Los Angeles are going to be weighed more heavily than, say, Denver is or Detroit is, because the overall metropolitan areas of those regions are substantially larger. But that doesn't mean that, like, it's going to overinflate how much things cost, because of the fact that just because New York by itself or Los Angeles by itself might have a larger metro area, if you're taking the entire Midwest of all the cities that are counted in the Midwest, well, who tend to have on average a lower cost of living, when you aggregate that out, it's probably going to weigh down some of those higher costs of living areas and get it closer to kind of what the average cost for every American is. So not every single region includes is included in terms of the measurements, in terms of what's reported. So they will take data from smaller populated areas, but that doesn't mean they're reporting it. So like they're not going to do a special report on Topeka, Kansas, or Cheyenne, or some rural community in Tennessee. They might use Nashville or maybe even Knoxville, but most likely Nashville or Memphis, or maybe they include those together. But they're not going to create a report that includes every single city in America or every single town in America. So that's why they're saying an urban American family, because they might suggest that maybe a rural individual has different things that they would include in their market basket than an urban population center. So maybe in urban population centers for transportation, they're focusing more on ride shares and public transit versus vehicles to kind of transport you long distances, because you have a longer commute when you're further away from the city. So all of these things are taken into account, but the goal is to try and create kind of a system that measures the changes in prices of kind of the biggest, most important items that the average person or the average family has to buy, to see how their purchasing power with their given income levels is going to be impacted by that. So as I mentioned before, market baskets are hypothetical sets of goods and services that a typical consumer would purchase. Basically, the consumer price index is going to include somewhere between 210 and 220 goods and services that are going to be considered to be typically consumed by households. Historically, what they did until, I don't know, about a decade ago, they would only update the market basket every 10 years. But I'm guessing that you can imagine that over the past maybe 20, 30 years, a 10-year time horizon might be too wide of a gap between the beginning of the decade and the end of the decade in terms of the underlying technologies and things that people buy. So, like, if you were to include VCRs at the beginning of the 90s, and then by 2000 everyone's moved on to DVDs and Blu-rays and things like that. you might end up overinflating the value of your cost of living because nobody buys VCRs anymore. So if there's only 3 left in existence, so you can watch your old Disney movies prior to the world of Disney Plus and streaming services, you would have to find it either on the cheap at like a flea market or something, or more likely on these days on like Amazon or something, where it would be like $1,000, or eBay for $2,000, because of the fact that like it's a vintage item, until they start mass producing it again for all of the uh, 90s folks. But again, because of streaming, um, it might not ever come back. So like vinyl came back because people like have a connection to their music, and they like the kind of the old style feeling of playing the records. But I think more people are into vinyl because of wanting to have an attachment to the things that they like again. So streaming services and things like that kind of take you away from that. So maybe we will have a resurgence of DVD purchases, or um, VHS tapes, because of the fact that people will wax nostalgic about things and feel like they own them, instead of having some sort of licensing thing where it's just kind of some tangible thing floating in the ether. So, but I digress. Market baskets are just going to be updated as needed. So if like next year someone invents something that completely changes how we live our lives, it could happen. Who knows? Um, then they might update the market basket as necessary. But otherwise, they will update it about every 2 to 3 years to make sure that the things that they're including are still relevant. So they are doing a better job of updating things now versus when they did update it, or lack of updating in the past. So is the price of a good the same everywhere? Uh, first thing that you should notice is, clearly I didn't do a good job copy editing or proofreading this slideshow before I revealed it to you, because is the price of good? Well, I'm just talking about a good, not, there is not only just one good in the world. The market basket includes 210 to 220. So is the price of a good the same everywhere? The answer is no. So I got that part right. I was able to spell no correctly. But the reality is that it isn't the same. So housing is completely different on each side of the country. On the coast, it's really expensive. In the middle, it's usually cheaper, although kind of the Mountain West is starting to be kind of the area in which everyone's moving to. So those prices are getting upward pressure on them. So um, you have, I think, the top two of the top 3 states that people were moving to are Idaho and Nevada. So I think Boise is the #1 city, and Vegas is #2 in terms of people moving into those cities. And so you're probably seeing increasing housing prices there. You see increasing housing prices in Denver and all along the Front Range corridor, northbound and southbound. Um, you even see it in the Midwest. Prices are starting to rise kind of in the Great Lakes region, because of the fact that people are starting to um, see the value in having access to those amenities. And when you compare it to kind of the steady state housing prices peaks that you've seen on the East Coast and the West Coast, people are trying to find a coast of any kind that isn't ridiculously priced. So naturally, even with housing prices, with food prices, it's significantly different across the country. And so, in order for us to get a good estimate of what the average price would be for housing, or what the average price would be for food, or what the average price would be for transportation, or what the average price would be for education or healthcare or anything like that, the way they're going to estimate this is that the BLS, so the BLS is the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So Bureau of Labor Statistics is BLS. So there's going to be, actually, originally there was 87 cities that were basically being surveyed. And what they'll do is they'll call people, they'll visit stores, although maybe these days they just use the internet to find prices of goods and services. But I've always imagined that my dream job would be working for the BLS, and I would kind of put my hood on here, and I would like put on some like sunglasses instead of these glasses and kind of go incognito style into the store and take weird candid photos of price tags and then run out of the store when people noticed me, and then kind of input the data into the computer system to do the calculation. In 2018, they actually lowered the number of cities from 87 to 75, although it turned out that they didn't really significantly impact the proportion of Americans that it included. I think the threshold used to be 1 million people in the population center. Now it's up to 1.5 million in the population center for them to do the full-on city calculation for the region. And so there was a survey of 87 cities down to 75. But they would basically survey about 20,000 different stores of all kinds of different products to kind of determine region by region and metropolitan area by metropolitan area what the average cost of things would be in there. And then once they get done with the metropolitan analysis, they basically say, okay, well, Detroit has 2.7 million people relative to San Francisco that has 6 and LA, which has 15. So Detroit is going to be 1/5 to 1/7 the weight as Los Angeles is. And then San Francisco is going to be like 2 times more weight than Detroit, but 1/3 the weight of Los Angeles. And so when they do that weighted average, it's kind of like your grade in the class, where if you're doing a weighted average, where it's like, oh, I got like an 80% on homework, that's worth 20%. And I got 100% on exam 1, that's worth 20%. So when I like weigh those, 20% and 20% is equal, 80 and 100, and then I get a 90% in the class. So the way CPI is calculated in terms of weighted averages is the same way that like you would do it when you have a course grade that has weighted averages instead of just a straight point system. And so for Michiganders, the Detroit, Dearborn, Warren, Michigan area is the only area that's represented by the state of Michigan. But the state of Michigan is represented in the Midwest division. For people that live in Wyoming, the Mountain West region includes Wyoming and all the states that surround it, like Montana, Idaho, Utah, Colorado, and I think there's a couple more. Kansas may be included, but I'm not 100% sure. But there is no metropolitan area in Wyoming that's included. And the cutoff for the Denver metro area, I believe, is Loveland or Aurora. So Fort Collins is not included either. It's, even though a lot of people would consider Fort Collins either its own metro area or just kind of like the fringes of the sprawl of Denver, it's not included in the it's not included in the official CPI metro area, but but again, they still do surveys of those areas, and they do report some of the information in the Midwest or the Mountain West report based on where you're living. And so they grouped kind of into like 6 or 7 regions for the regions, and then states are set into 6 to 7 regions. And then for the overall analysis, they will aggregate all this into one final number. And then if you want like city by city, they will report like the city by city links to the regions. Anyways, this Bureau of Labor Statistics place is pretty neat. If you ever want to find CPI or even unemployment, because when we talk about unemployment, they're also the agency that's in charge of that as well, or bureau. I shouldn't call them agency because they're a bureau. Sorry. BLS.gov, BLS.gov is going to be the website that you would go to find that information. So I believe the January unemployment rate came out on Friday, as well as CPI. So every single month they report consumer price index and they report unemployment, and it's usually the first Friday of every month. So chances are, since Friday was the 5th, that they would report it then. But basically, if you're just randomly thinking about unemployment or randomly thinking about consumer price index at any point in your life, just know that there are 3 constants in the world: death, taxes, and that the unemployment and CPI report will come out on the first Friday of every month at around 7 or 8 in the morning Eastern time. So CPI is pretty consistent and reliable in terms of its reporting, as well as unemployment, because they're done by the same agency. So how are we going to calculate consumer price index? It's going to seem a little bit like the GDP deflator calculation. It's going to seem a little bit like the real GDP calculation, but it is neither of them perfectly. So if you take some of the elements of us calculating GDP deflator in the previous lecture and some of the calculations of the real GDP in the previous lecture, you will get a good idea of how we're calculating this, but I would just implore you to kind of just treat this as its own separate entity and its own process. So that way you kind of know the steps that are relevant to this calculation versus the GDP deflator calculation versus the real GDP / nominal GDP calculation. So consumer price index, I will abbreviate as CPI, is going to be calculated the following way. It is the cost of the market basket in the current year. So again, we're going to have this current year versus base year thing that we had for real GDP and nominal GDP, where basically there's going to be a chosen year that is going to be kind of the normalized base year for determining what prices are. The difference now, though, is that we're not going to be using the prices for every single year. We're just using that as a baseline. And then when we calculate the consumer price index of subsequent years, we'll be actually using the prices within the corresponding years all the time. So what that means is that what CPI is actually defining and what it's telling you and what you're calculating is what proportion, by what factor basically, more expensive is the current cost of the same basket of goods as it was compared to the base year. So if I'm trying to buy the same 10 items on a grocery list in 2021, how much more expensive is that grocery list now versus 6 years ago, versus 10 years ago, versus 50 years ago? And so CPI is just basically a fraction that's telling you the ratio of how much more expensive things are relative to the base year that you've chosen. So when you calculate the CPI, the denominator will always be the same for whatever year you're calculating. With GDP deflator, it was dependent upon the level of real GDP that you had in the given year. But the nice thing about CPI is once you've calculated the cost of the market basket in the base year, that is the denominator, whether you're trying to calculate it for 2 years, 5 years, 100 years, the denominator will always be the same. The only thing that changes is the numerator, which is the specific cost of that same market basket in the year that you're caring about, with the prices in the year that you care about. You plug that in, calculate that, put that in the numerator, compare that to the cost in the base year, which is the denominator. That fraction times 100 will now give you an index. Again, it's an index. There's no percentage, there's no units, there's no dollars. It's just a number. And the percent change of that number is going to allow for you to calculate the inflation rate again. The same rule of thumb applies for this because it is a price level or price index. If you are measuring the value of the CPI in the base year, the answer will be 100 again, because the top will be 1, or the same as the, excuse me, the top will be the same, the bottom will be the same. So the ratio of that will be 1. 1 times 100 will give you 100. So whenever you have the base year for any price level, GDP deflator, CPI, PPI, it's going to be 100 in all cases. After the base year, you would reasonably expect that the CPI will be greater than 100. And in the years prior to the base year, well, the prices are going to be lower than the actual base year price. So you would reasonably expect that CPI will be less than 100. Now, the number you'll have to calculate and interpret correctly, but in terms of the actual ratio or relativeness to 100, it will be less than 100. So how about we do an example? So here's an example. The base year is 2009 again. So if we're trying to calculate CPI, we're going to use 2009's prices and the cost of the market basket in 2009 as our denominator for calculating consumer price index. Now, here's the difference between calculating CPI and calculating like a real or nominal GDP. You're going to multiply across a couple columns and you're going to add down the rows just like you did last time with real GDP and nominal GDP. The difference now is that the quantity is going to be fixed. So when we were taking prices in one year, multiplying them times quantity in another year, you had like a bunch of different rows and columns you had to keep track of. The nice thing about calculating consumer price index is quantity is always fixed because the market basket is fixed. Basically, we're trying to estimate what the average cost of a grocery list in a bunch of different years is when we're calculating CPI. So we don't want to make the grocery list different because then we won't be actually able to compare how much more expensive that same grocery cart of goods is between one year and another year. So if we want to calculate the market basket cost in 2009, what we're going to do is, again, the quantity is fixed. So the same quantity will multiply times the 09 prices and the 2016 prices to get our cost of our market basket. So if our market basket of goods is someone studying for the exam, it's going to be ramen packs, coffee, and notebooks. So the base year is 2009, so the cost of the market basket in 2009 is going to be 30 times 20 cents. And then you're going to add that to 5 times 2. And then you're going to add that to 10 times 150. So we're doing just like last time. 30 times 0.2 is going to give you $6. 5 times 2 is going to give you $10. And then 10 times $1.50 is going to give you $15. And when you add all that up, you get $31, which is the same that we got right here. So the cost of the market basket is $31. Now that we've calculated the cost of the market basket in the base year, our denominator is going to be 31 for all calculations with this market basket. So if we want to calculate the consumer price index in 2009, we don't need anything else because the cost of the market basket in 2009 is the same as the cost of the market in the base year because it is the base year. And so this will cancel to 1. You multiply it times 100 and you end up with 100 as your CPI. Didn't even need to do the calculation. You can just know it and report it, but just wanted to show you the consistency of what we're trying to calculate here. Meanwhile, if we're trying to calculate the consumer price index of 2016, and what we're going to do instead is we're going to multiply the same market basket times these prices now. So we're multiplying 30 times 0.25, which is 750, 5 times 3, which is 15, and then 10 times 1.6, which is 16. So when you do that, you get 16 plus 15 is 31, plus 7.5 gives you 38.50, which is the same as we calculated here. So now we have the numbers that we need to calculate the consumer price index in 2016. The numerator is $38.50 because that's how much it costs in the quote unquote current year, which is 2016. And then we're going to divide that by the cost of the market in the base year, which was $31. So $38.50 divided by 31 times 100 is going to give you 124.19 as your consumer price index for 2016. So what do we do with these? Well, the whole point of doing this process and calculating the consumer price index is to be able to find the inflation rate. How much have prices gone up between one year and another year? And so since we have our numbers, all we have to do to find the inflation rate is to take the percent change of the CPI. So percent change is just new value minus old value. Divide that by the old value, and then take that quotient and multiply it times 100. So you have 124.19 minus 100, divide that by 100, and then multiply that times 100. So this cancels, and then you're left with 124.19 minus 100. And so your inflation rate is actually 24.19%, which by macroeconomic standards is extremely high. Naturally, what we want is somewhere around 2% inflation in the overall economy. Now, naturally, like education costs and healthcare costs and housing costs are going up much faster than that. So maybe we're seeing 10 to 12% inflation rates in those areas and some of the worst cases of inflation. And so 24.19% would be the inflation rate for this example. So the big takeaway here is, how do you calculate CPI? And then once you've calculated CPI, you plug it into the percent change formula to find the inflation rate, because we want to estimate how much prices are more now versus how much they were in the past. So that's how you calculate CPI. Now, is CPI a perfect measurement? It absolutely is not a perfect measurement. It's got its own shortcomings. In fact, it has what we call 4 biases that are included in consumer price index based on the way it's calculated that may overstate or understate the true level of inflation, most likely overstating though. So even though we see inflation is 3%, oh no, inflation's beyond our 2% target. The reality is though is that it might actually be overestimating it. So the estimation is through these 4 biases here that CPI is potentially overestimating annually the inflation rate by 0.5 to 1%. So that means that so that's not like 1/100th or 1/200th of the overall rate. It's saying like in terms of its actual percentage value. So if it turns out that like you get a report of inflation being 3%, there's a chance that based on these biases that the inflation rate is actually only 2.5 or 2%. So that is one of the shortcomings of having these shortcomings. So the first bias that we have is the substitution bias. Substitution bias is kind of the most egregious assumption in consumer price index that makes it overstated. So the reason why that's the case is the following. If we go back to our good old-fashioned demand curve, we realize that the demand curve is downward sloping. The downward slope of the demand curve indicates that there is an inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded, which is the law of demand. The law of demand states that holding everything else constant that might influence demand, if we increase the price of the product, there will be a decrease in quantity demanded. And if we decrease the price of the product, there will be an increase in quantity demanded. So the issue that comes up with substitution bias is that the market basket quantities are not changing when price goes up. So if we go back to the way we just calculated consumer price index, notice that between 2009 and 2016, that's a 7-year gap. Now, granted, it's a cooked up problem, but we have a 7-year gap here, but the market basket quantity is exactly the same. We saw that we had 25% inflation rate over that period of time. We saw ramen go from 20 cents to a quarter. We saw coffee to go from $2 to $3. We saw notebooks to go from $1.50 to $1.60. Based on the law of demand, all of those things increasing in price would suggest that there would be a decrease in quantity demanded. Yet here we are with a demand curve that's vertical, aka there is no change in quantity demanded, even though we had an increase in price. So naturally, what might happen in the real world is that you might have normally bought 30 ramen packs, but once it went up to 25 cents, you're like, nah, I'm going to buy 26. Or, oh, coffee's more expensive, I'm going to buy 3. Or notebooks are more expensive, I'm going to buy 9. So in reality, that's what will actually happen. But because of the fact that you're just saying that people are just going to suck it up and buy the full 30 and buy the full 5 and buy the full 10 because they have to or whatever, you're overstating the inflation rate because you're not taking into account the reality of what people do, which is they'll just buy less if they can't afford it. And there'll be a decrease in quantity demanded as a result. So you can suggest that CPI is actually overstating the level of inflation because of the fact that we have this substitution bias. The second category is increase in quality bias. So one thing to think about is think we established in this class and in a lot of my classes that I've taught in the past that most students, or quite a large proportion of students, own iPhones and utilize iPhones. Now, iPhones this will be their 14th year. So iPhones became a thing in 2007. And the original iPhone cost $600. Now, I know these days there's a bunch of different types. There's the small one, like the SE/S version, or C version. Actually, it was the C version. I think of the iPhone 5, that was the small mini version. And then you now have the SE version, which is kind of like a souped up version of the C version of the iPhone 5. You have like the regular good old fashioned iPhone. You've got like the giganto, like basically a tablet computer version of the iPhone, and of all varying price levels. But let's just say that the standard issue iPhone these days costs $800. If the iPhone increases in price from $600 to $800 between 2007 and 2021, unfortunately, consumer price index is going to chalk up that, let's see here, 33% increase in the price of the iPhone as pure inflation. It is not going to account for all of the improvements that have been made to the iPhone. So if you think about the iPhone back in 2007, it made calls, it texted. You had kind of like, it was basically an iPod Touch of the day and age that basically made phone calls. You had like Candy Crush on there maybe, and like iTunes and some other apps. But I don't even think it had a camera. And if it did have a camera, it didn't have flash on it. But then again, it didn't have a flash for like 8 to 10 years after. So I guess that's not a big deal to iPhone users of the time. But so increase in quality bias, the mistake that happens is it's stating that our price changes are happening because of inflation, not because of the improvements. So think about all of the things that the iPhones of these days have. You can take professional photographs with an iPhone. You can call people with an iPhone. You can take high quality video and make movies with an iPhone. You can play games. You can do work. You can go to school on your iPhone. Some of you may be going to school on your iPhone right now. You can run Excel, run programs on it. You can code in it. So There are so many different things that you used to have to buy multiple different projects for, or pieces of a technology for. So think about back in 07 when you would buy an iPhone. You pay $600 for this iPhone that makes your calls and sends your text messages. Then you buy a laptop that helps you do your schoolwork and write emails and use Excel. Then you also buy a camcorder to film videos. You buy a digital camera, either a DSLR or the kind of the square ones, to take your professional photographs. Now you can all do all of that with one device. So before you might have had to pay $600 for the phone and $500 for the camcorder and $300 for the camera and $1,000 for the laptop. So before you used to have to spend $3,000 for the actual stuff that is packed into a modern day iPhone. And so the reality is that there really isn't inflation in the price of the phone. In fact, it's actually cheaper that everything is housed under one device versus having to buy a bunch of different ones. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't need to buy other ones. Maybe you have different taste preferences or needs, so you still need a separate digital camera, or you need a fancy camera, or you need a laptop. So that's not to say that it's erased and eliminated the need for those things, but it has for a lot of people. And so the CPI is saying that it's inflation, but in reality, it's actually saving us money by allowing to have all these devices housed under one little rectangle. New product bias basically says that because of the fact that the CPI historically until recently was very slow to update the market basket, that it would actually fail to account for changes in market, changes in demand, changes in types of things that people would typically buy. And as a result, it would be potentially overstating the price of things or the value of things because of the fact that they were either obsolete or the things that people were buying weren't actually factored into the market basket because it didn't exist when the market basket was created. And then lastly, the outlet bias. Outlet bias and new product bias are kind of things that have been rectified for the most part, but these first two really are things that are built into CPI that are problematic. Outlet bias meant that it failed to take into account internet providers. So like when I said the BLS was going in the stores and stuff like that, like it wasn't going to like Walmart and places where lots of people shop. It was going to like the mall or bougie places where maybe only like the upper scale type of customer would purchase things from. And so it was kind of overstating like the cost of things because maybe most people don't pay the price that they're using for their analysis. Maybe it's cheaper because of the fact that you have Amazon or Walmart or online retailers that allow for you to get a better discount. And so it might be overstating inflation because of that. So that's not to take away from the rigor that is used to calculate consumer price index. So the way you're calculating it is pretty straightforward, but they go through a lot of vetting process to figure out how do we sample this correctly. So like when it comes to unemployment and when it comes to inflation, the actual calculation is very simple, but the methodology to get to that point in terms of cross-sectioning America and finding the right businesses and finding the right people to survey that's representative of what America looks like demographically is very difficult, which is why the Bureau of Labor Statistics works with the Census Bureau, who is in charge of doing the decennial census. I think that's what it's called, the decennial census, which is every 10 years to determine how many people exist, where they are, what their demographics are. So that way, when we want to ask the questions and survey them and get more data off of them, we know where to find them. And they can use their fancy cameras to find a survey population of 50,000 people that fits all of the demographical proportions in terms of ethnicity and gender and education level and geographic location, which is pretty neat. So is inflation a problem? Naturally, you would probably think that it probably is a potential problem because we're measuring it. If inflation wasn't a problem, then we probably wouldn't talk about it. Just like if converting nominal variables to real variables wasn't important, we probably wouldn't have talked about it. But because we have to, It is important, and so we do talk about it. So when it comes to inflation being a problem, in theory, it shouldn't be. This is kind of the introduction to the first avenue where the theories of macroeconomics have variance. So principles with like supply and demand and comparative advantage, like Ricardian economics and Marshallian economics, all of that is pretty agreed upon. It's pretty widely accepted and believed to be true. The problem with macroeconomics, which is a good problem because it allows for us to kind of keep pushing the needle forward in terms of how we understand and analyze things, is that the economic theory is not 100% perfect. So the way you're being taught this class now might be completely different than the way it's taught 20 years from now, meaning that there may be new economic theories that'll build off of the ones that you're learning about right now, but have been kind of innovated and revised to kind of match up with the continuously added data points and experiences that we've accrued over another 10 to 20 years of living in the economy that we live in. But the OG theory, the original theory, suggests that inflation shouldn't be a problem because whenever businesses raise their prices, their workers clamor for higher wages to offset the higher cost of living they're now dealt with. And or the other way around, if the firm pays higher wages, then prices will have an uptick in them as well that basically make nobody better or worse off. Basically, your real wage, so again, like I said, there's real GDP, real interest rates, real wages. The real wage is basically your purchasing power. So your real wage should be constant, even if your nominal wage is going up. So like if you get a raise from $15 to $20 an hour, firms will raise their prices to offset that gain. Subsequently, on the other side, if prices go up, firms will also pay you more because the market force is saying like you need to pay me more so I can live, to make inflation not an issue. However, again, this theory kind of makes sense for the most part in terms of, like if we decide to raise prices, then we'll end up paying our employees more. If we pay our employees more, prices will go up. So like the theory suggests it might not be a problem because everyone will kind of just be status quo and where they're at. So like even if you get a raise from $15 to $20 an hour, like you'll feel better, which is known as like money illusion, but your purchasing power might remain the same or get worse. And we'll talk about that in a second. But the reality is that for most people, wages do not always increase simultaneously. So if gas prices go up by $1 a gallon tomorrow, is your employer just going to magically give you a wage increase to offset that? Probably not. If the cost of your rent, like so maybe your lease is up in the middle of the year and the landlord decides to raise the price by 10%, but you only got a 50-cent an hour raise, which basically breaks down to like a 1 or 2% raise, well, then you're actually worse off, even though you have more money in your pocket, so to speak, because of the fact that you have more physical nominal dollars in your pocket like these, but you actually can't get as far with them because your rent is so much higher. And so naturally, we are going to have problems with inflation, particularly with the wage price breakdown. But also, even if we know inflation is coming, it can still cause problems on the business side or even on the individual level side. Mostly for the individual level side, but partially for the business side. When we talk about unemployment, we'll talk about minimum wage a little bit more. So I'll table the discussion about minimum wage because it kind of leans into this inflation discussion. In fact, the main arguments against minimum wage are an inflation argument and an unemployment argument. And I will explain to you how, even though the theory of inflation suggests there shouldn't be a problem, there's so many frictions in the market that make it basically this theory impossible to really happen. But those who are like adamant against minimum wage increases stop where the in theory part They don't listen to the actual, like, here's what really happens in the world part. So like they turned off the lecture after this and said, like, I know everything about economics. I believe in minimum wage being like 7 cents and not like $15 or $18 or $12 or whatever minimum wage ends up being, and based on where you are and what the circumstances are. But long story short, inflation does cause problems, which is why we talk about it. The first one is that it affects purchasing power of income. So I've mentioned this before. There's this weird situation that's known as money illusion, where your purchasing power actually diminishes as your nominal income goes up. But because you believe that, oh, I have an extra $5 bill in my pocket, I've got more money, I could buy more stuff. Well, it turns out that the thing increased by $8, so you actually are worse off than you were before. But because you have $5 more, you think, oh, well, I'm rich now, so I'm going to actually overspend. So there's this thing called money illusion where people end up spending more money even when their purchasing power goes down. But it's still a problem even if they're spending more money, because then they'll have even less at the end of the day. But basically, the first issue with inflation is that it affects the purchasing power of income. There are winners and losers. Most of us losers, but a few winners. Basically, if you have a fixed income, or an income that decreases, or an income that increases at a rate slower than the inflation rate, you will be worse off as a result of inflation. So if prices go up, the average prices go up by 6% between now and your next raise next year, you're going to be negatively impacted for that entire year, and your purchasing power is going to be diminished. So even if they raise your wages by 6% at the end of this year and at the beginning of next year, you still have a whole year's worth of purchasing power losses from that 6% inflation rate. And then as soon as you get the 6% wage increase, inflation goes up by 2 or 3% again. So even though you've kind of offset your losses from the previous year in terms of how much things cost, you're not going to get back the money you had to overextend and spend more on. But you will also be diminishing your purchasing power again when inflation goes up 3%. In reality, every time you get a raise, it's most valuable the day you get it, and then every day afterwards, your raise becomes less and less valuable until you get another raise. And so the reality is that, like, you can get a raise from, I don't know, $15 to $17 an hour, but if like your average costs go up more than a 2/15 ratio, which is about 1.7 so probably looking at about 16% or something like that, 15, 16%. If your costs go up faster than 15 or 16%, then you're actually going to have less money in terms of purchasing power. So because of inflation, whether we know it's coming or not, if you have a stagnant wage based on the job that you're in or the industry that you're in, or the cost of living adjustments or the raises that you're getting are slower than the inflation rate, then you will be negatively impacted. If your income increases at a rate equal to inflation, so this is what is known as the classical theory. So we have what's known as classical theory versus Keynesian theory. The classical theory suggests that money is a medium of exchange and that prices and wages will instantaneously offset each other. And as a result, nobody will be better or worse off. So if that is the case, if you just so happen to get a 3% raise every year and inflation happens to stick to 3% all the time, then you will be no better or worse off as a result of inflation. However, if it turns out that your income is increasing faster than the rate of inflation, then congratulations, you actually have an increase in your purchasing power. Unfortunately, what happens is most people, when they get an increase in their wages, they get an increase in nominal income and nominal wage. So they believe that they're all making more money and they're all getting richer. But in reality, only a few of them are actually becoming more wealthy. So lots of raises, and this is kind of a big thing in employment talks and corporate cultures and things like that, is to say, hey, look, like, I should be getting value. I'm gaining more experience so I'm becoming more valuable. And then people are like, okay, well, you're 2% more valuable than you were the year before based on your longevity. But the problem is if they say you're 2% more valuable, they're actually saying you're just as valuable as you were the year before, because of the fact that 2% is really just keeping your status quo the same, trying to maintain that. And so my purchasing power went up when I moved from one job to the next job, because the next job paid 20% more than the previous job. And so no matter what inflation was, I was able to beat it out based on that jump. But that jump ain't going to happen every year, and I don't plan on jumping from job to job constantly. So that will diminish, and my increases in purchasing power may diminish or stagnate after a given period of time. So winners and losers as a result of purchasing power being affected by inflation. I got ahead of myself with the interest rates. We'll talk about those in a second. The second consequence of inflation is that even if we know that inflation is coming, there's going to be costs associated with changing the prices. So if you're a business and you decide that you want to, or you're increasing higher costs, you're incurring higher costs, your costs are going up. And so like maybe you used to offer the $5 foot long, but now you can't afford to offer it as a $5 foot long or else you'll lose money. So you have to raise prices. You don't really have a choice. But there are two kind of consequences when a firm decides to raise their price. We just talked about how there's like a bias in the CPI because it assumes that your demand curve is what quote unquote vertical or perfectly inelastic, meaning that no matter what price you charge, the quantity demanded never changes. That's what the CPI is making the assumption of. But in reality, we know that our demand curve is downward sloping. And so that means that as price goes up, our quantity demanded decreases for our goods and services. So if you're a business and you are raising your price, that's going to cause you to lose some business. So you're losing some potential revenues because you're raising the prices. So that's the first problem, is that if you raise the price, you decrease quantity demanded for your product. The second problem that arises as a result of inflation is what are known as menu costs. The reason why they're called menu costs is because if you're a restaurant and you raised your prices, you have to print out a new menu to show the public and inform the public that the prices have changed. So menu costs are the cost to firms for changing prices. So if you've ever worked at a grocery store, they change the sales every single week, or any retail store for that matter. They change the sales every week. So they hire people to physically print out all the new price tags, rip off all the old sales tags, and stick on the new sales tags. That's a job. You have to pay someone for that. You also have to pay to print out the new tags. You also have to pay for the ad time to sponsor things and inform the public through radio and television, streaming services. You also have to print out like the print ads. So all of that money to inform the public that you've raised your prices is known as menu costs. So as a business, whenever prices go up that dictate and result in you having to raise your price to keep pace, those are known as menu costs. So the reality is that even if you know inflation is coming, you can't even prepare for it. So like you might be able to prepare for like wage changes and you might not be able to. But if you're a business and you see that your costs are going up, you can like prepare for it, but you can't really avoid the costs that are going to come with changing the prices or the lost revenue from decreased quantity demanded as a result of the higher price. The other two variables that are impacted as a result of inflation, the first one is paper money. So that was obvious. So I got this $5 bill here, this crisp Lincoln. It feels good that I have $5 in my pocket, but the actual purchasing power of this $5 is becoming progressively less valuable the more I hold it. So I've used this dollar bill in a bunch of lectures over the past few months, and I still have it because I haven't found a good reason to use it yet. But every single day that it sits in my wallet or on my desk, it becomes less valuable. Now, it depends on what you buy. There can be some things where it becomes cheaper the more you wait, and that $5 might be more valuable for that good. But overall, based on your um, overall cost of living, based on rent and education and food and services and stuff like that, that $5 bill is becoming progressively less valuable. So like if you dedicate your $5 bills to buying things that are at the dollar store, then yeah, maybe your purchasing power isn't changing. But if you're just treating your $5 as something that's a portion of the entire budget that you have to buy your food, your groceries, your healthcare, your education, your transportation, your gas, your rent, all of that, then it's becoming progressively less valuable. And so every time inflation goes up, paper money becomes less valuable. That is also true for coins. So even so, as paper money, I don't want to discriminate against these copper and zinc and silver coins over here, dimes and pennies and quarters. They're also becoming less valuable over time, unless it just so happens that it's a collector valuable version of one, and then that becomes more valuable. Or if it just so happens that you have a weird banana logo printed accidentally onto your dollar bill, and then that dollar bill is now worth 200K. So not all paper money loses value, but most paper money loses value. Almost all of it does. And coins lose their value as well. Unless we're talking about cryptocurrencies where they may be gaining value, losing value. We'll talk about whether they're money or assets or not later on in the course when we talk about money. And then lastly, interest rates are affected. So inflation affects everything. Everyone's so used to the nominal world, but we're in the real world here. Economics is all about the real world. So nominal values like with money and with wages and with interest rates and with gross domestic product, like nominal numbers are cute. Nominal numbers are how we live our lives. Like if I demand a salary, I don't convert it to real terms. I convert it to nominal terms because that's how I get paid. I don't get paid in real terms. I get paid in nominal terms because my employer still lives in the fantasy world of nominal values. Same thing with interest rates. You want to buy a house, you want to buy a car, you're going to be subjected to changing interest rates. Now, interest rates are the cost of borrowing money. So basically, it's if you're trying to borrow money, as in taking a loan, you can't really say, well, the amount of money I want to borrow is $25,000. I'm going to pay you $27,112 for $25,000 worth of money. That doesn't really make any sense because if you're going to promise to pay back that, why don't you just borrow the $27,112? So the reality is that when you borrow money, the value of it is measured in the interest rate. And so most of us are used to an interest rate. Okay, I pay 6% on my car and I pay 4.5% on my house, or I pay 29.99 on my credit card. So there's a bunch of varying different interest rates that you see. All of those are, again, in nominal terms. But don't get discouraged or upset about the actual number, because the reality is because of inflation, you may be getting a good deal. Now, 0% is always the best. So if you can get a 0% interest rate for anything, by all means do it, so long as you need the product and it provides utility and you can actually afford to buy it in the moment. Because 0% interest is the ultimate, because you're not paying any interest. And when inflation keeps surging over time, and you pay it back over an extended period of time, the amount of money that the institution that you're borrowing from is getting back is going to be worth a lot less than the day you bought the house, bought the car. So how do we determine what the actual cost of borrowing is? Well, there's this neat little equation that was discovered, surmised, suggested, theorized a long, long time ago by a guy named Irving Fisher. And the Irving Fisher equation is the following. It's saying that the real interest rate, it's very simple. The real interest rate, so which is the actual percentage of the loan that you're paying back in terms of basically profit to the company that you're borrowing from, the bank, the lender, etc. The actual cost of borrowing is the nominal interest rate, so the one that you signed on. So like the little like note that you sign on your mortgage and says, I promise to pay at this rate, and you signed your name on it and dated it, and now you're forever indebted to it. That is the nominal interest rate. So if I sign a car loan at 4%, then 4% is the nominal interest rate. So I want to figure out what the actual cost of borrowing is. What is the real interest rate? Well, all you have to do is subtract the inflation rate from it. That's all you got to do. So if you take out a car loan at 4% and the inflation rate is 2%, then that means the real interest rate is 2%. So there are going to be times in which you have really good credit and your interest rate is still going to be like 3, 4, 5%. And the reason for that is because the bank or the lending institution has to factor in inflation into the nominal interest rate they give you, or else they'll lose money. So there could be a time in which your credit was crappy, but inflation was low, and you got a better interest rate than when your credit was great, but inflation was higher. Because of the fact that the bank has to factor in two things when they decide how much they're going to charge you for interest. The first thing is creditworthiness. So do you pay your bills on time or not? Do you have the means to actually pay this back? If you're unreliable, you pay a higher interest rate. If you're really reliable, you pay a lower interest rate. And so basically, the more reliable you are, the closer the creditworthiness aspect of the interest rate is zero. And the more risky you are, the higher it is. But if you pay your bills on time or you don't pay your bills on time, there's going to be an aspect of the interest rate that is always rooted in inflation, because the bank has to realize that, like, yeah, if I charge you 4% interest, I theoretically will get more actual physical dollars back than I gave you. And theoretically, I'm making a profit nominally. But in terms of the purchasing power of the money that I get back in 5 years from now, there's a chance it might be worth less than the money I gave you today. So like whenever you take out a car loan that's like 3% or 4%, or a mortgage these days, it's like 3% or 4%. Car loans are at like zero. Like in normal circumstances, like maybe a car loan's like 4 or 5 or 6 or 7%. Depends on who you are. So like I have family members who pay like really high car interest on their cars, and then I have family members that pay really low interest on their cars. I don't have a car payment at this moment, so I don't have to worry about any of that. I do have a mortgage payment, and that's higher than it could be based on refi rates, but in terms of the car, I don't have one right now, but I did have quite a few over the past few years, but I finally paid those cars off. But anyways, you can be so like let's say you take out a car loan for $20,000 and you take it out at 3% interest. The reality is that you're not, if inflation is 4%, that means that the real interest rate will be negative 1%. So if you borrow a car loan at 3%, the inflation rate over that time is 4%. That means the real interest rate is negative 1%. So the takeaway from that is not that you are going to end up paying fewer than $20,000 back. It's not because the real interest rate is negative 1% that you end up paying like $18,000 back. What a negative real interest rate says is that if you pay the car back, so let's say you borrow it at $20K, you'll end up paying back probably about $22,700 to $23,500 in actual dollars over the time period of that car loan. But the actual value of the money that the bank receives back, say $23,000, will actually be worth less in 2025, 2027, 2030. It'll be worth less the $23,000 will be worth less than the $20,000 they gave you the day you bought the car. So that's what real interest rates are telling you, is that basically you'll still be paying back more than you borrowed, but the purchasing power of the money you pay back will be worth less than the money that you borrowed, which is why 0% interest is awesome, because you're just paying back the exact nominal value that you borrowed. And so that means that your real interest rate is absolutely negative, significantly negative. And that means that the bank will actually lose money in terms of real purchasing power of the money they receive. And you will actually end up with more value from the money that you borrowed, even though technically the car depreciates, so technically maybe not, but you were able to buy more with the money that they gave you now than the money that you actually paid back to them, which I think is fun and cool and neat. And then again, this just kind of summarizes that. If inflation is higher than expected, then borrowers will pay less real interest. So if the bank isn't very good at accounting that, then you might end up with a negative real interest rate or a lower real interest rate. But if inflation is lower than expected, then borrowers will pay more real interest. So the example I'll give is with two cars that I borrowed, or two car loans that I've borrowed, not two cars. I didn't borrow the cars, I bought the cars, but I borrowed money to get them to get the loan and to get the car. So first time I bought a car that I didn't pay cash for. First time I got a car loan. I had just graduated law school, and I was just delivering pizzas and stocking groceries. And a month after I ended up buying the car, I ended up quitting both jobs and basically being unemployed for 2 months until January of the next year. I don't know why I did it. I just did it, and it happened to work out. So I'm happy that I did it. But anyways, I had okay credit score, but I didn't really have a good credit history because I was renting and I had a couple of bills to my name, but I hadn't had a long-term loan besides student loans. So the first car loan that I borrowed was 3.18%. Okay. I went back about 2 years later to get a second car. And at that time, my income level had basically quadrupled, maybe even quintupled over what I was making when I bought the first car. My credit score was way higher, maybe like 150 to 200 points higher. And so I was like, heck yeah, my credit's awesome. I've got a good job. Like, I should be getting a really good rate of interest. Well, my interest rate for that car was 2.73. So my interest rate was lower, and it was about 0.45 lower. So almost 0.5% lower, which is a decent drop. But the reality is that I was expecting it to be lower. Well, I wasn't expecting it to be lower because I'm an economist, but I was hoping that it would be lower. I was hoping I could get it down to like 1.99 or lower twos, but it was basically only less than 0.5% lower than my first loan. So the reason why that was the case was when I bought the first car, the inflation rate was about 0.7%. So the real interest rate of this car was 2.48%. But when I bought the second car, the inflation rate was 2.1%. So even though the interest rate nominally was only a little bit lower, the real interest rate was actually 0.63%. So I actually, in terms of real interest, was getting a significantly lower interest rate than I was at the time. So my real interest rate was 1.8% lower than it was the first time around. Now, naturally, inflation went to 2.1 here, so that actually dropped this real interest rate down significantly, down to, let's see here, 1.08. So that was cool. But that goes to show you that, like, It's not just about creditworthiness when it comes to borrowing money. It's also about kind of how much prices are going up and how much money is becoming more expensive over time.